Wednesday morning, rush hour in London, clinging bleakly to the inevitable commuter line, the Balham office of a Brighton-based detective agency. In this unlikely setting, final plans are being made for an undercover operation in the Spanish island of Majorca, one that is both risky and controversial, the recovery of a tug-of-love child from her father's home.
Yes.
3-year-old Helen Serra is at the centre of a bitter row between her English mother and Spanish father. An agony for both sides that began when the marriage broke down 2 years ago, and Mrs. Marion Serra made a dash with Helen from their home in Majorca to England. But in June last year, the father snatched the child back in defiance of an English court order giving care and protection to the mother.
So what went wrong when you got married? When did things start going wrong?
Well, it was very difficult, you know, because he was, well, out there they have different views on women, you know, and their wives and that, different than what wives do in this country. And we argued quite a lot, you know. He seemed to want his own way. He wanted me to do things in his way, not how I wanted to do them. And we seemed to argue more over the child, because he wanted me to do things, you know, as he wanted them. And of course it wasn't how I thought they should be done, you know.
Helen was a ward of the English High Court, but its jurisdiction covers only England and Wales, and Mrs. Serra and her own father, Mr. Fred Astridge, faced a frustrating and expensive legal battle. In desperation, they turned to the Brighton private detective, Ian Withers.
So far as Spain is concerned, we have been given an undertaking by our clients that, to the best of their knowledge, no court order has been made giving protection to the child in Spain. So on that basis, we don't think, so far as we know, that we are breaking any civil court law.
And if the mother makes the snatch, it's not kidnap?
Well, no, of course not. If the parent of the child makes the snatch, then they're perfectly at liberty to do so.
Although you're not breaking the law, don't you feel that you might very well end up in Spanish jail?
Well, one certainly looks at the possibility, and we feel that we've weighed this one up and taken into account all the risks, and hopefully we will pull it off successfully.
If the mother makes the snatch, is she okay acting legitimate?
Well, so far as we can tell, yes, she's the parent of the child, and I don't know of any country which actually refuses, without a specific court order, the right of a parent to see or take it or its own child.
So Withers, working with 2 detectives from other agencies, moved into a fringe area of the law which is only too hazily acknowledged by the courts. For if a ward of court is taken out of this country, the English High Court can only assume that foreign courts will act reasonably and take this into account. In past tug-of-love cases involving mixed nationalities, this has not always been apparent. There has been a marked reluctance for courts to find against their own subjects.
We went back to see the solicitor, and he said that there was absolutely no chance of winning
No chance.
the court case.
No chance at all. The child would definitely be given to the husband.
Why was that?
That is Spanish law.
Because he's a Catholic, and of course I'm not a Catholic, and they're very religious out there. They feel that he could bring her up more religiously than I can.
But the man in Spain is the head, the boss of the family. The wife has no rights or authorities at all.
While Helen was in her mother's care, her father, Jaime Serra, was granted reasonable access in England, provided he surrendered his passport.
Against my wishes, access was given to my daughter's husband to come and see the child. Now, I've no objections to him seeing the child, but they granted him access in the High Court of 9 hours per day. That's from 9 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock at night, uncontrolled, unwatched. And I stated at the time in the High Court, when this was being decided, that this child would definitely be kidnapped.
In fact, Serra dodged passport controls by taking a day trip to France with his daughter and returned to Spain.
Well, it's very difficult, really, with any of these so-called tug-of-love affairs. it's a very complex situation, and one can sympathise very easily with both sides. I think in taking on an assignment of this nature, you have to evaluate the situation and decide and believe that you're doing the right thing for the future of the child. And in this case, I think it is proper that the child should stay with the mother, having been unlawfully taken from England in the first instance.
But apart from that, what's in it for you?
Well, basically what's in it for us is about £1,500, out of which we have to pay our staff.
On top of this, there's considerable expenses to take into consideration on top of the fees. And we also had to weigh up very carefully the risk factor involved. As we came across on the ferry from the mainland and saw the port of Palma appearing, none of us knew really what to expect or what form of security would be there. And of course our client was extremely tense, to put it mildly. She was suitably disguised, and we keyed in towards the dock, and hopefully our man would be waiting for us with the car so that we could disembark and get her out of sight extra quick.
The man on the spot, Agent Terry Platt, had been in Spain for a week making arrangements for their stay and watching the apartment block where the Serra family lived with Helen.
Well, his job primarily was to weigh up the situation, to keep observations and to ascertain the programme, if one exists, so far as the other parent is concerned. And he has reported back, of course, his sightings of the child and ascertained the school situation. And he will also have arranged for us a hideout in the form of a villa or flat in the Palma area, fairly close to where the snatch will be made.
Let's take the case as it stands at the moment. We can either abandon this child, which nobody in my family will ever do, or we can take certain risks. Now, if we've got to take those risks to get this child back, then we've got to take them. If it means that my daughter is apprehended, then I'm sure that she'll do her best to get out of the bother that she's in. It won't be the first time the police have apprehended her.
We arrived at the flat that the first agent had arranged before we came to the island. This was a flat which lay about 8 miles east of Palma and literally on the doorstep of the father himself, the father of the child. And once we got settled down in here, we would be discussing the plans, and then for the next 2 or 3 days, we would be going over the whole system of the snatch. We would be checking the distances, the times, and we would know the area backwards.
Every morning the grandfather comes in from town and he picks up the child, and around about 9:30 to 9:45 he takes her up the road to a little convent school in one of the back turnings. The father, around about 5:30 p.m, goes to the school and picks up the child and returns her back to the flat. After doing the observations and watching them very carefully, I don't believe the snatch should be done anywhere on the public streets, because the school is the best time to take the child.
Marion Serra was taken on a dry run to see if she could still recognize her daughter, who had now been separated from her for 8 months. For her, it was the worst moment of the trip. Her brief and unhappy stay in Spain as a young wife and mother had ended in a stormy clash with both her husband and the Spanish authorities, who might possibly have taken proceedings against her. But her greatest concern was whether her daughter, who no longer spoke English, had forgotten her.
William, I think the best thing to do now is for me to take you round to the flat, because it's getting towards 5:30, and as you know, at 5:30 he goes round to the school, picks up the child and fetches her back. So if I take you round there and put you in a very good position so that as she gets out of the car, Marion can get a full frontal view of the child.
Yes, I think that's very important, because Marion must be able to recognise the child instantly as and when she goes into the school, and therefore it would refresh her memory if she saw the child, seeing that it's 8 months now since she last saw her, and she could have changed somewhat. I think if we could go round there almost immediately and then see what the position is.
Mr. Jaime Serra, who had been looking after his daughter with the help of his parents, is employed as a courier for a travel firm based in Palma, a job he held when he first met Marion during a 2-week holiday on the island. Baby Helen was born 9 months later in England, and the two parents were married in Letchworth 6 months after that, before leaving to live in Mallorca. The child, therefore, had dual nationality. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the case, Mr. Serra had proved his determination to fight to keep the child. The mother's family was equally determined to get her back.
Now, why do you think that you have a right to fight to bring your grandchild over here?
I think I have a right because my grandchild was born in England, was born before the marriage, and for the first 5 months of this child's life, we heard nothing from the father. He didn't want to know us. He never sent 1 penny towards my daughter's expenses or my grandchild's future. He never sent 1 penny. And that is why I'm so... Had he been a normal man who had come over and seen my daughter before she had the child and looked after my daughter before marriage, I would have had a completely different attitude towards him.
Now, apart from the emotional cost, what does it cost you financially?
£3,000 plus.
The day of the operation, the getaway cars are hired and move into position. Marion Serra, wearing wig and glasses, prepares for her part of the operation, the reason she has come to Spain, her presence insisted on by the detectives. Terry Platt is disguised as an American tourist. His job is to go into the school to help Marion in the recovery. But first they watch as the Serra grandfather delivers the child to school. The time is 9:30. There is no sign of police, but the grandfather is slow in leaving the scene, and Marion has the chance removing her wig and walking into the school while he is still there.
We've talked this over as a family. Marion knows the risks she's taking. She also knows that if she doesn't take these risks, we shall never get this child back to its rightful owner, its rightful mother. So, yes, I'm very apprehensive. But if Marion wants it this way, then I'll back her.
You don't think
100%.
Marion could be happy without
No,
the child?
definitely not. I've seen Marion this last 8 months, and I know what it's done to Marion, not having her child with her.
Terry Platt is already inside the school. The grandfather is still in the vicinity, so Marion turns her face away as she heads for the main entrance of the school. Platt will point out the classroom.
I went in just a fraction ahead of the grandfather and the child because I wanted to make sure that I definitely knew where the classroom was, so when I called the mother in, we could go over to the classroom, talk to the teacher, take the child out straight away and come out of the school without any problems at all attached to it. And we did. We came straight out to the car, got in the car, and off Ian drove round to the second car.
Well, my first impression was the child, who was totally confused at this stage. We drove away fairly promptly so as to avoid any attention and went round the corner and parked at a pre-arranged place. The mother took the child's coat off and left it in the car, together with a copy of the English court order. We then walked across the road with the baby and put her into the second car, which was the so-called clean car. There was no way this could be checked back to her or to us. And the child was taken across with the mother, got into the car, and we drove away towards the hideout. The first car that we'd used, the one that was in the name of the mother, was then taken off and eventually split up to the airport, where it was parked in a no waiting zone, the object being that when the car was eventually found, the authorities would know from the evidence in there that the child had left the country and it was taken by the mother and not by third parties, thus avoiding any possibility of a serious kidnap hunt. We then took the drive back towards the flat fairly easily so as to avoid any panic to the child, and after a matter of some 10 minutes or so, the child seemed to recognise the mother and started to cuddle her and call her mummy. We got back to the flat, and Marion, the client, was very tense at this stage, having got the child, and went across the road and into the hideout. We duly parked up and followed her in. The kiddie by this time seemed to have settled down reasonably well considering the circumstances, and it wasn't very long before she was really quite happy, and obviously happy, to be with her mother. She cuddled toys that the mother had bought from England for her and enjoyed some English sweets, and seemed to be totally at ease despite this rather dramatic method of meeting her mother after a period of some 8 or 9 months. She seemed very happy and smiled a lot and spoke Spanish, constantly spoke Spanish to the mother, although she seemed to understand the English language quite well, but answered always in Spanish. In the meantime, the first member of the team had followed through and contacted England and tried to arrange for some telegrams to be sent out to the father and to the local authorities out there, with a view to avoiding any possible conclusion that the child could still be in Mallorca. We hoped that they would believe sincerely that we'd all got back to England.
The ruse worked, but it was not until 5:30, when the grandfather went to pick Helen up from school, that the Serra family discovered that she had been taken. They immediately jumped to the conclusion that Withers had banked on, that Helen was already in England with her mother, although in fact she was hiding out in the apartment just a few miles from their own home. Jaime Serra took the first plane to England, where he was promptly handed over by immigration to the High Court. Mr. Justice Reeve declined to pass judgment on his defiance of the court in removing Helen from her mother's care, but Immigration Control were not convinced that he intended a short stay, and sent him back to Spain. In the meantime, his wife's party had made their escape by ferry from Mallorca.
I think the tensest moment of all was the getting off of the island, and we all believed that once we'd left the island of Mallorca, we would be halfway home. But the moment came and we duly went aboard the ferry to the mainland. We went on very early to try and avoid any possible suspicion from the authorities, who abounded at the port of embarkation. And having entered the ferry and suffered a rather nasty sea voyage across to the mainland, we arrived in Barcelona, where the first member of the team had gone and got the car ready for the last road stage of the journey.
Didn't you have any difficulty getting off the island of Mallorca itself then?
Well, in fact, there wasn't any actual difficulty other than personal tension, because we weren't aware of what restrictions or security would have been taken. We weren't aware whether we were wanted at that stage. However, we entered the car at Barcelona, and having got through the port security, which in itself was a very tensing situation, and there seemed to be so many police officials around, and of course when you're in that particular spot, you imagine that everybody's looking for you, whether in fact they are or not. Helen, of course, was enjoying the journey, and we left Barcelona, and before very long there was a police car alongside us with a rather nasty loudspeaker and trying to flash us over to stop, and we thought this was going to be it. In fact, we were just driving in the wrong lane, and that was some relief, I can assure you. We followed the motorway down, and Helen took the road journey very well for one so young, and considering this really dramatic change of circumstances, she drove along very happily. Everywhere we went, there seemed to be police, constantly police, no matter where you went, and they always seemed to be looking. Eventually we got to the border, and this really was the final stage, and we sat in our French registered car and hoped we'd get away with being French tourists without any check at all, but we had to show our passports. And when they saw the British passport, they seemed to accept this without any form of check at all. And we eventually drove across and into France, and there was some sighs of relief. Having entered France, of course, we really were on the tail end of the journey. We were safe and dry in our minds, and had anything gone wrong at that stage, we felt that the French authorities would tend to support the English court order rather than lean towards the Spanish situation. And we drove along towards Toulouse, and where we hoped eventually to board a plane back to England fairly quickly. The child was totally settled and extremely happy. She was chatting away all the time and thoroughly enjoying the journey, and it was quite obvious to us that she was happy to be with her mother at that stage. There was no pining. She didn't even ask for her father at any point at all. We left Toulouse airport fairly early in the morning, and mother carried her to the plane. The kiddie was very happy to go on an aeroplane. It was quite an exciting venture for her. We then flew from Toulouse and had to go via Bordeaux for customs clearance, so even at these points, although we knew we were clear, they were still points of tension all the time. At any stage we could have been stopped, and we weren't aware what precautions had been taken.
Were you sure of your legal ground throughout all this, or did you think that you might be in dodgy territory?
Well, I think we all knew and appreciated that if we had been caught or the job had gone wrong in Spain, that it would probably take us a number of years to try and talk our way out of it. The Spanish authorities are rather infamous for putting people in jail and talking at some future date.
You've been involved in one case before, in the Derimo case. This is your second case, and I believe you've got another one in the pipeline. How do you feel about getting involved in this sort of thing, where a child's happiness is in the balance?
Well, it's a very difficult situation, really. I think one has to weigh up each case on its own merits. But I think in this particular instance, the reunion between the mother and the child made us absolutely sure that we had made the right decision, and it was correct for this child to be with her mother.
But there is a legal loophole here. I mean, why do a team of private investigators have to be involved in helping this family's problems?
Well, unfortunately, every country has its own laws and its own beliefs, and of course there's no real solution to some form of international agreement on domestic issues, which are really very personal ones.
How did you feel when you met that press reception and the grandparents at the Heathrow airport?
Well, we were completely surprised and stunned by the press reaction on arrival. The grandparents were very emotional about seeing the child again after so long, and I don't really believe that the grandfather thought we would ever pull it off.
What about the effect on the child, all that publicity? Do you think it's going to have a lasting effect on her?
Well, I think at her age it's something which will just slip into the background as new things come along, and I don't imagine it will have any great effect on her once she settles down that's home again.
Any moral qualms yourself about getting involved in a case like that?
Well, I don't think so, really. People that have a problem have got to seek some support somewhere, and after all, it's one of those unfortunate things that to make one parent very happy, the other parent must, of course, become very sad.
Down the stairs.
All right.
It's all right, don't worry. Okay, that's all right.
What was the really worst part of the operation for you?
I think really from the time we got there to the time, the waiting time, from the time we got there to the time that we actually did the snatch, you know, it was, I wanted to see her all the while, you know.
And what happened after the snatch? Was it bad then, waiting to get out of the country?
Well, I think my time was taken up with, you know, talking to her and looking after her.
It's what I dreamed of. It's what I've dreamed of now for nearly 9 months. But I knew I'd got a good team. I knew I'd got the best team in the country. But I didn't honestly believe we would get this child back. Knowing the authorities in Spain, in my heart of hearts, I've got to say that I didn't think we'd get her back.
Now, certain events have happened involving the father.
Yes?
Can you tell me what you feel about them?
Well, the father was apprehended in Manchester, as you know, by the immigration authorities, and he was taken to the High Court in London yesterday. I had instructed my family solicitor, who was at court, that as long as Helen and Marion were within safe reach of these shores, that I had no objection to Mr. Serra not being imprisoned. He faced imprisonment.
You didn't want him
I
imprisoned?
didn't want him imprisoned, no.
You had what? You had a film crew with you and a team of investigators. How did you feel operating under those conditions with those people? Did they help?
Well, I think we were all more or less together, you know. We sort of, we were like one big team, really, you know.
Did you have any bad moments when you thought it might go wrong?
Well, I got very upset, you know, when I couldn't see her, but, you know, I pulled through.
How did you feel when you first saw her, when you saw her after 8 months' absence?
Very relieved.
Mr. Astridge, you've been waiting for this for a long time. How did you feel when they came through that customs gate?
Well, the first impressions were fantastic, but then I just couldn't face it. I had to stop in the background for a little while and recover a little bit of composure before I could even go and see the child. It was overwhelming, actually, to me.
Do you think it's been worthwhile seeing the family together again?
Well, I think it speaks for itself. It's quite a bonus on the job to see the reunion.